Hello, everyone. I think we'll get started now. And welcome. I'm Janet Bruff, Senior Development Officer for the Georgian Bay Land Trust. And tonight brings our 2026 LandMark Speaker Series to a close. We thank you all for your interest and attendance through these past few months. If you have any suggestions for topics next year, please send them my way. And before we begin, if you have any questions during Karen's presentation, please post them in the chat box, and then we'll get back to you at the end of the presentation. I would now like to introduce you to Karen Koornneef, our Corridor Project Ecologist. Karen holds a Master of Biology from Lakehead University. Her background is in freshwater ecosystems, and for her master's research, she studied multiple peatlands and explored phytoremediation, alongside broader work on peatland plant communities, including sphagnum. She has also had the chance to build hands-on skills in sphagnum identification through mentorship from an emerging biologist. Her broader freshwater work includes studying plankton communities and microinvertebrates and how these biological communities relate to water quality. Tonight, Karen will be speaking about Sphagnum Boss, the story of an ecosystem engineer. So over to you, Karen.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Janet, for that introduction. I'm excited to talk to you tonight about this incredible plant that grows in the Georgian Bay area and just how important it is to us. So let me just share my screen. Excuse me one second here. I just need to get it running. Most of us walk past moss every single day without thinking very much about it. But sphagnum moss is one of the most important plants on the planet. This small, soft plant actually engineers entire ecosystems. It controls how the water moves through the landscape and changes the chemistry of the environment around it. It even helps to regulate climate change. Peatlands, which are ecosystems built largely by sphagnum, cover only about 3% of the Earth's land surface, but they store more carbon than all the world's forests combined. So today I want to show you how this seemingly small and simple plant works, why it's so powerful, and how it helps us to understand and protect the environment. Here in the Georgian Bay area, we have sphagnum that grows all over the inland areas and the island areas, particularly as we go north on Georgian Bay. The reason for this is because Georgian Bay sits on the Canadian Shield, which is a very strong rock formation that has very thin soils and poor drainage. So it tends to pool water, which is what sphagnum really likes to thrive in. Through this interaction, it builds bogs and fens, which are formed when wetlands fill in with floating mats, and these take millions of years to develop. Sphagnum also plays a very important role in Georgian Bay in filtering out pollutants and sediment before they enter the lake. They reduce flooding and drought by helping to regulate water levels, and through all this, they also help create cleaner lakes, which support our wildlife and fishing and recreation. Now, sphagnum is like a lot of other mosses, but it can also be very different. For example, like other mosses, it has no vascular system. So that's that interior system that most plants have that transport the water up and down through the plant. But sphagnum and other mosses also have no roots. So instead, they have rhizoids that hold them to the surface that they're growing on. And they obtain their water and nutrients through other means. They also are very different from other mosses in that they have no costa, which is the midrib vein that you'll see in this leaf here down the center of it, and it kind of gives the leaf support. And sphagnum doesn't have that. Instead, it uses a two-cell combination that fills up with water that helps support it. Sphagnum is over 20 million years old from what we understand, and it's very interesting because it can prevent other plants from growing around it. So what makes it so unique? Well, there's a lot of ways that it's unique from other plants. One of the things is that there's around 36 species in eastern Canada. And these species can be different colors of browns, greens, and reds. Now, some species can be either green or red depending on where it's growing. So, for example, a moss that's growing and it looks colored green is probably growing in the shade. But when it's red, it's typically growing in the sun. And that's because it has a special pigment that it releases to prevent the UV light rays. And so it turns red in order to help protect it. So the more red that plant is, probably the more sun it's receiving. Now, sphagnum is also what we consider a keystone species. So this means it's a species that has a disproportionate large impact on everything that's around it. It absorbs nutrients through the leaf surface as opposed to the vascular system, and it alters the pH of the water. It also acts as a giant sponge, and it can hold up to 20 times more than its weight in water. And this is really important when it comes to flooding, because when we have these big rain events, sphagnum is able to uptake and hold on to that water and then slowly release it as the environment gets drier. Sphagnum moss is also a bioindicator. And so what is that? Is that it's an indicator, a bioindicator is an organism that is either a plant, an animal, or a microbe. And it's used to monitor health and quality and changes in the ecosystem. So it's kind of like a measuring stick for the environmental conditions. Just like we use frogs to tell us about water quality, or we can count insects to assess stream health, we can also use sphagnum to help understand the environment that it's in. It responds really, really rapidly to changes because it's so sensitive, and this can occur faster than many other indicators do. It accumulates pollutants from the atmosphere and from the environment, and these can give us cues as to what's happening within that ecosystem. So because it's so sensitive to nutrient levels and other things, such as water levels, it can really play an important part in telling us about the ecosystem that it's living in. And we can also take the sphagnum plant to a lab and have it analyzed for what type of pollutants it's in, and that helps us to understand what's occurring in that environment. So before I dive into a little more things about sphagnum and how great it is, I'm going to give you a little bit of a biology lesson here just to help you understand some of the things I'm talking about. So sphagnum plant has two different types of branches. One is called the divergent branches, and those are the ones that stick out from the main stem, and they kind of cuddle up with their buddies and get close together, and they can form like a canopy top that helps to keep moisture in and creates its own little micro habitat. There's also branches called pendant branches, and those ones hang down, and they assist with water movement through the plant through capillary action. Together, these are called a fascicle. So it's basically where the branch clusters together on the stem. And then at the top of the plant, we have that moppy top looking component, which is called the capitulum. And this is the area where the plant has primary production. So it grows from this area. And all those little branches become the bigger branches as they grow out. And this is also the area where photosynthesis occurs. Next, I want to explain a little bit about the cell structure, because that will also help you to understand this a little bit. Sphagnum is one cell thick, the leaves are one cell thick, and they have two different types of main cells. The hyaline cells, which are very important in water storage. So these are the cells that are able to accumulate 20% of its weight in water. It happens through these cells. When a sphagnum species grows in a drier area, they tend to have bigger hyaline cells. And so this helps it to be able to absorb water and then release it when it gets really dry. The hyaline cells are also responsible for ion exchange, which I will talk about in a little bit, and they also aid in species ID. Next, we have the green cells, or the chlorophyllose cells. And these are responsible mainly for photosynthesis and the structure of the plant. And together, these two cell arrangements can give us much information about the species. And lastly, we have the pores. And these also aid in water storage. The pores open and close letting the water in and out of the cell at the right point in time. So we use all these bits of information in order to ID the species, because they can be really hard to judge what species they are by the naked eye, because they're small plants and they're very similar looking. So when we're trying to ID a sphagnum species, the first thing we do is we go through a key and we look at the first part of that, which is the arrangement of the branches. So we look at how the branches are arranged. Sometimes they have more pendant branches and sometimes they have less pendant branches. So we look at the arrangement of these and count them, and then we can move to the next stage, which is to look at the leaf. On this slide, I have a picture of two different leaves that are dyed bluish color. The one on the left is a branch leaf, and the one on the right is a stem leaf. And we can look at these leaves, and we look at the shape and the size of them. And these leaves are about 1 millimeter big, so they're very, very small. But they can tell us some information by just looking at the shape and the size of them. And then the next part that we move on to ID is we look at the cell structure. So in order to do that, we take a few of these leaves, which again are very, very small, and we have to cut them into cell-sized bits. So we're taking these tiny leaves and making very tiny cuts, and it takes a lot of practice and a lot of patience, but if you work at it, then you can do it. And we get what we're left with when we get a one cell cut is this cross section that looks like the bottom picture. We look at the arrangements of the two different cell types in this cross cut, and that's what we're able to make the final ID with. So I know I've mentioned a few times now about sphagnum changing the acidity of water. And one of the reasons, I think it's a very fascinating thing that it can do this, first of all, because it chemically engineers its own environment through this. And like other plants, sphagnum uses photosynthesis to get their energy. But unlike other plants who use the vascular system, that plumbing system, if you want to call it, to get its nutrients, sphagnum plants don't have that. So they need to do that in a different way. So since it has no roots, it absorbs nutrients through its leaves, and it does this by exchanging hydrogen ions for other positively charged minerals like calcium, magnesium, and potassium. And when it does this, it lets go of those ions into the surrounding water, and that's what makes the water around it acidic. So since it has no protective layer, no cuticle layer on top of the leaves, it's able to do this through the cell walls. And the plant is able to accumulate not only just the nutrients that it needs, but also other nutrients and pollutants. So you might be wondering, well, why would they want to do this? Why would they want to make the water more acidic? And the reason that they do this is because changing the acidity of the water makes it harder for other plants to compete with it, because it's only specialized plants that are able to grow in that type of environment. It also discourages herbivores from eating it, because I can't imagine it tastes very good. And it slows down the microbial activities, which can cause disease. So in a way, it's kind of doing it to protect itself. Next, I want to explain to you a little bit about the development and the structure of peat, to give you a little bit more background of it. So what is peat? Well, it's basically really slowly decomposing material. So because the sphagnum has made the environment around it so acidic, and there's very low nutrients in it, and it's constantly waterlogged, and there's very low oxygen, all these components work together to really slow down the decomposition of the plants that have died there. And as it builds up over time, it develops peat. Now, peat builds up very slowly, approximately 1 millimeter per year. So it takes roughly 1,000 years just to make 1 meter of peat. So that's a very, very long time. Water moves through peat in, and just to let you know, the acidity in some of these peatlands is quite acidic. So it's probably comparable to pickle juice or vinegar. So it is quite acidic. When water moves through peat, it can move through several different ways, but the easiest way to explain it is it can just move through the pore system. So as the pores have space between them, the water will just move through that. Sometimes the water moves into a section where the pores have really come close together and the water gets trapped and the pollutant and nutrients in that area get trapped as well. They can also move through diffusion into areas where the cells have closed really tight or they've compacted due to the pressure and the weight of the material above them. So as we go through deeper down in peat, the cells tend to be, or the pores tend to be closer together because of the weight above them has crushed them, and has also crushed those hyaline cells that I talked about that store all that water. So in essence, it traps everything there within it. There's different types of peat as well, and they also have some influence on how the water moves through them. So again, they both also have small and big pores, but the sphagnum peat, so ones that are mostly made up of sphagnum, they tend to have a larger pore system on the top. And then as I mentioned, as you get deeper down in the peat, the decompression reduces those pores. In peats that are made up more of sedges, so these are more richer fens with more nutrients, they're a little bit more uniform pore system, but they do have other pathways that control the water faster as well. So for instance, when sedge plants dies, because they're tall and long, if they get pushed over and they're lying vertically, then the water can use that as a pathway to move. But again, as you get deeper and deeper into the peat, it's going to be more compressed and less pathways for the water to move. We find most of the pollution in a peatland in the top 40 centimeters. And one of the reasons for this is because if you think about how much time it takes to make peat, which is 1 millimeter per year, so 40 centimeters is about 400 years. And that is in correlation to the time of industry starting. So when things started changing in the earth and we started releasing more pollutants, then that's the pollutants got stuck into that top 40 centimeters. And the reason that they don't migrate vertically down through the peat is because those pores have now become so tight that it prevents the movement of the pollution deeper into the peat. When we want to study history, one of the really incredible things that peat can tell us is that history. We use peat cores to look at history through segments in time. So I'm just going to quickly take a step back here and explain that different environments, different peatlands have different acidity and different nutrients. So we have peatlands broken into two main groups, which is bogs and fens. And they are based on how the acidity is. So the bogs have the lowest acidity, and they also have the lowest nutrients. It also depends a little bit on how the water enters those systems. So in a bog, the water is entering that system through rainwater only. In a fen, we have a little bit less acidity and a little bit more nutrients. And the water coming into those systems is a combination of rainwater, but it can also be through other tributaries or through groundwater. So we have this gradient from poor to rich, which again is also a gradient of nutrients and acidity levels. And because of these changes, we get different looking decompositions within those peat cores. So these peat cores can tell us a lot of information. So for example, a peat core from a poor fen can give us a lot of information about temporal resolution. It can give us information of sometimes to the decade, but also talks a lot about carbon sequestration. Cores from a richer fen can tell us a little bit more about water change levels and nutrient levels. We use a instrument, I think there's a few of them, but one of the ones that we've used is called a Russian core, and it takes out segments of about 30 centimeters every time you use it. So you put it in, you extract a 30 centimeter core, and then you put it back in and extract the next 30 centimeters and so on until you hit bottom. A paleoecologist will take these and cut them into 1 centimeter sections sometimes and take a look through that as like a time capsule. So it's almost like reading the rings from a tree. You can get a lot of information if you examine each one of those 1 centimeter sections separately. And if you go from the top down through history, you can learn a lot about history by looking at things that are not fully decomposed because of the peat cores. So we can see pollens, we can see spores, plant fragments, insects, charcoal, even human artifacts left inside these cores. And I just want to show you a little bit of a close-up here. So if you look at this one from a poor fen, you can see that there's still lots of bits of plant material left in them. And if you think about how deep this is, these are 30 centimeters and say this is about 20 centimeters deep, you can see the plant fragments are still there. They're not very well decomposed at all. And just so for a little bit of background information, this little Mickey Mouse looking thing here, that is a white pine spore. Pollen. It's white pine pollen. So things like this are well preserved within these cores, and they can tell us information. This one here is from a moderately rich fen. And again, you can see that there's a lot of plant material still in there, but there's a little bit more decomposition that has happened in this core than in the other one. And then this one is from a moderately rich fen. And you can see that there's a lot less parts of plants in here. It's much more decomposed. But if you were to open that up a bit more, you would still find a lot of plant material in them. So the other things that are left in there, like the pollen bits, just different things that are left behind that do not decompose over time, can tell us a lot about the forest succession and changes that have occurred there. They can talk to us about climate change and land use change. So for example, if we see ragweed starting, then we can think about whether or not that's a time that maybe Europeans settled in the area and they started clearing land, which was releasing the ragweed. We can also see when forest fires occurred from little bits of charcoal that are left in there. Or maybe we'll see corn starting, corn pollen starting. So that might give us an indication that agriculture started in the area at that time. So by examining these peat samples, we can learn some really information about history and reconstruct timelines, but they also help us to understand how these peatlands will respond to future changes from climate. Moss can tell us stories in lots of different ways. And I don't want you to get worried about all the words on this page, but what I want you to understand is that the different types of fens that I talked about previously, they have different types of sphagnums and mosses growing in them. And so this is really helpful for an ecologist when we walk into a peatland, that we can understand what type of a peatland it is. So for example, if you look at the column that says poor fen, you'll notice that all those Latin names start with an S for sphagnum. But when we move into a moderately poor fen, you can see there's a mixture of some other names in there, and those are the brown mosses. And then when you go to an even richer fen, you're going to see much more of a mixing of the two types of mosses. So it's really important when we walk in that we can understand what environment we're in. We immediately know what the nutrient levels are in that peatland, because the sphagnum will grow where there's less nutrients. But it also gives us a warning sign too. If we were to walk into that fen 2 years ago and it was all sphagnum growing there, and then we walk in there now and suddenly there's some brown moss species in there, we know that something's changed. We know that there's been an input of nutrients or pollution into that wetland. And so we might be able to kind of go through and see if we can find out what happened and mitigate that. Peatlands have a lot of little microhabitats, and I'm trying to illustrate this with this slide. As you can see on the left-hand side is a picture of a peatland, and the picture that's adjacent to it with all the colors are the various different sphagnum that can grow there. They're sphagnum, different breed or different species like different amounts of water, and they like different amounts of nutrients and different amount of light. So they'll grow in different areas that suits their needs, their little ecological niche. And we find the same thing if you look at the cross section of other plants as well. So the sphagnum will help to create these little small micro communities, and it can completely change from one centimeter of depth to another, as you can see in this illustration. The different colors vertically represent different sphagnum species, but then we can see that within those sphagnum species, there's different types of vegetation that will grow in there as well. The round leaf sundew is growing closer to the highest point of the hummock, which is a kind of like a mound of sphagnum moss, whereas we have bladderworts that grow in the water. And so the sphagnum, due to what it likes, also changes the habitat little zones for other plants as well. So what is really important to take from this is that if each of these little species like their own particular environment and type of environment to grow in, you can understand that if there's a bit of change in hydrology or in nutrients, it can cause a devastating loss. And just a shift of a few centimeters can totally wipe out an entire life zone. So it's really important to maintain the environment of these peatlands. Peatlands also have a very diverse landscape of plants that are in them. I just talked a little bit about some. So the sphagnum creates these little microhabitats that I talked about. And in doing so, they've created a habitat for specialized plants. The plants that can grow in some of these peatlands have to be highly specialized in order to grow there because of the lack of nutrients and the acidity. So we have some coniferous plants that grow there, such as sundews and pitcher plants and bladderworts. And these are all plants that have an adaptive ability to gain nutrients through other means. And so they ingest bugs by doing that. They've developed a way to catch the bugs, to entice them in, to catch them and hold on to them. And then they use enzymes to help break them down and extract the nutrients. Orchids, although they don't do the same process, they also have preferences of nutrients and water as well. So some orchids prefer to live in peatlands that are lower in nutrients, and others prefer to live in peatlands that are higher in nutrients. And within one peatland, we can have different areas with higher and lower nutrients as well. All this also supports a high density, high variety of macroinvertebrates. There's roughly 6,000 arthropod species within Canadian peatlands that have been identified, and these include all sorts of things such as dragonflies and spiders and beetles, all sorts of different bugs that are in there. But it also creates habitats for other amphibians and turtles and snakes and birds that rely on these different mosaics of wet and dry microhabitats. In addition to that, we have microscopic organisms in there that are also specialized to only live in these environments. So it's important to understand that these environments are in need of protection because, including the fact that they are specialized plants, there's also a lot of species at risk that live in these environments. Sorry, I forgot to click through these for you. Peatlands are a very important interface between aquatic and terrestrial systems. They are a gradient basically from dry upland edges into wet and aquatic systems. And they have dry areas, and then they have saturated soils, shallow waters, and sometimes even open waters, depending on the peatland. All of this occurs within a very small area. And we have many species, as I spoke of just on the last slide, that live in these environments. And they depend on this unique hydrology. Now, some of these species have dual life cycles. So that means that they don't always stay on a peatland, but they use it for part of their life cycle. And it's important for that part of the life cycle. So for example, the Massasauga snake, it hibernates there over the winter in peatlands, but it doesn't stay in the peatland for the rest of the year. It will be out on rock barrens during the summer, and it moves back and forth. And we have a lot of different animals that do this. We have birds that will lay their eggs there, but they won't stay there the rest of the year. We have different migration of birds that come through there and use it for different things, such as maybe for hunting. We have other turtles and frogs that will maybe lay their eggs there, or they use it for hunting. So it's very important for these animals and species that need the area for dual life cycles. If these areas are degraded to the point that they no longer exist, then I think we are able to say that these species may no longer exist as well, because they won't have the habitat that they require for a certain part of their life. And in addition to this, the wetlands also offer corridors and different areas for species. So the ones that use the dual habitat, they might always return to the one peatland for one part of their life, but they also travel to other areas for another part of their life. And it makes that connection so that we have genetic exchange. I think it's really important to emphasize just how vulnerable peatlands are and how fragile they are and why we need to protect them. Peatlands really depend on a stable hydrology, so they need their water to stay at a reasonably stable level. And any changes to that can really cause differences and upset the entire wetland, as I just talked about, that even tiny little increments like a couple centimeters or inches can really make a big difference on what's occurring in that area. When a peatland is disrupted or damaged, it's very, very difficult to fix. There has been restoration, but it really returns the peatland back to its original function. Because if you think about it, if it took millions of years to create it, it's really not possible for us to put it back into that position again. And unfortunately, peatlands can be easily altered by simple things such as inputs of water or inputs of nutrients. And that can easily happen through construction of roads or buildings. It can happen through septic systems that aren't working properly, and all of a sudden that nutrient is entering into the wetland somehow. So there's lots of things that can happen to these ecological areas that make them very difficult to, it causes a really big change and makes it very difficult to fix because they have such narrow tolerances. And unfortunately, the hard truth is that even though we try to restore peatlands back to their original function, as I mentioned, we really cannot rebuild what it took millions of years to create. Humans have long recognized the importance of sphagnum, although it's interesting how science is now confirming this. Historically, sphagnum's been used for many things, and it was used by First Nation communities for baby bags. They would harvest some sphagnum and dry it out, and it would be placed into the baby bag to act basically as a diaper, and the antibacterial component of the sphagnum would help prevent diaper rash. It was also used during World War I and II as a wound dressing, because again, it absorbed a large amount of blood and fluids from wounds. Again, it has the natural antibacterial properties, so it was able to prevent infection and prevent sepsis. It has been used for food preservation, again, because we take advantage of those antimicrobial qualities of it, and it's also cool. So it helps preserve food without it going bad too fast. And it's also been used for bedding and insulation in homes, etc. So it's really been long understood that it's important. Not only can sphagnum help us understand our water quality, but it can also help us understand our air quality. Scientists can take extracted mosses and dry them out, and they place them in these bags. And then they can hang the bags from trees and posts. And this is especially good in areas where it's hard to reach, it's hard to get good equipment in, or you want something that's not very costly. So after the bag is hung there for X amount of time, they are removed, and the sphagnum is taken to a lab and analyzed to see what pollutants are in there. So they'll be looking for any changes in pollutants from the atmosphere. They can look for increases and decreases. They can monitor for the movement or how far pollutants are traveling from their original source. So it's very important in more ways than in just the water, and it's very effective, as I've mentioned before, at helping us track pollution patterns. Most of us have probably heard that wetlands are wonderful at filtering water, and peatlands are as well. They are kind of like nature's natural water treatment plant, and they have many different mechanisms that work together to do this. So one of the ways that it does this is that when water comes in and it's carrying sediment, the sediment is often got pollutants attached to it because they like to attach to things, and we call these colloids, and they like to attach to them. So as they flush into these wetland systems and peatlands, they are slowed down as soon as they hit that area. And it's because there's things in the wetland that naturally slow them down, such as plants. And so when the water slows down and the particles slow down with them, then the particles will sink to the bottom and settle. For the smaller particles that don't sink to the bottom, these ones get trapped in those pores that I explained to you earlier. So some of them might flush through some of the connected pores, but they'll get trapped in the dead end pores, or some of them, sometimes the larger ones will still go through and eventually get trapped into another pore system. Another mechanism that happens within a wetland is that chemically, there's a chemical attraction of pollutants to the sediment, and so it naturally wants to attach to something. And because peatlands are low in oxygen and they're also acidic, it tends to be one of the situations that makes heavy metals lose their mobility. And so when they lose their mobility, then they'll settle and stay trapped in the peat until something changes that environment. There's also microorganisms that work in a wetland, and they help to break down pollutants into less toxic forms. And then there's something called phytoremediation, which is the ability of a plant to uptake and absorb heavy metals and pollutants and trap them. And they either trap them in their root system area, or sometimes they will go to the upper area of the plant and they will be transformed there into less harmful components. So all these things help for when the water is released from the wetland, it's much cleaner and has a lot less nutrients in it. And of course, peatlands also store a large amount of water, which it releases slowly over time, and this helps prevent flooding downstream. Peatlands and other wetlands, you might have often heard the term sink or source. And so peatlands are often considered a sink of heavy metals. So what that essentially means is that there is more um, heavy metals and pollutants staying in the wetland than there is coming into it. If something is a source, then there's more pollutants or heavy metals leaving that wetland than there is coming into it. So generally speaking, peatlands and wetlands act as a sink for heavy metals and pollutants. As I mentioned earlier, the metals will bind to the sediment and bind to the peat particles and settle there. And there's also the low oxygen and the acidity that also helps maintain a low mobility of heavy metals. So they become really long-term storage areas with minimal release of pollutants. However, that can change. A wetland or a peatland can change from a sink to a source through changes in the environment. We talked a little bit about earlier about decomposition, and the reason that decomposition in a peatland is slow is because there's not very much oxygen. But if the water level goes down and the peat is now exposed to oxygen, then the peat will start to decompose again and break down. And during that breakdown, it can release those pollutants that are in that area back into the environment. And the last component that I want to talk to you about what sphagnum can do is it is a long-term carbon sink. As I mentioned earlier, peatlands only cover 3% of the Earth's surface, but they store more carbon than all the forests in the world together. And they do this through uptake through photosynthesis, which is the first component. And then, as I mentioned, peatlands slow down the decomposition of things because of the acidic and anoxic or low oxygen conditions. So that creates the very slow decomposition, because if the carbon is within that plant and the plant is not decomposing, then the carbon is not being released. And so over time, with all the peat developing over top of these plants, eventually that carbon gets buried into that peat and it's contained. So we have peatlands that are meters and meters deep that contain carbon from thousands and thousands of years ago. So this carbon is stored for centuries. However, just like the pollutants, changes in hydrology can reverse the carbon sink into a carbon source again. So if we allow disturbances to occur, then again, that peat can start to decompose through changes and it can be reversed. And the sink of carbon can now become a source of carbon. So protecting these peatlands is one of the most important things we can do in order to fight climate change. And so just to sum everything up for you, I just want to reiterate how important this tiny little small plant is that builds these incredible ecosystems by changing the acidity of the environment. They build these incredible habitats that support unique, often species at risk, and have specialized dual life cycle species that live on them. They are highly sensitive to disturbances, however, so any type of disruption can alter the microhabitats and alter the species that are living there. Peatlands that are created from sphagnum are also incredible records of climate and history change, and we can learn so much from them by looking through them. And then lastly, it's the sphagnum that drives the production of the peat, which stores a lot of carbon and helps us get through climate change. So in closing, I just want to suggest of what you can do to help if you're interested. And one of the important things that you can do is to learn to recognize these important peatlands and have a better understanding of them. Understand what drives them to change and do what you can to support conservation initiatives like Georgian Bay Land Trust. Be cautious about the activities you do that might change the water flow and nutrient flow into the peatlands, and spread the word. A lot of people haven't heard about sphagnum and how important it is, and they don't understand what it does. So spread the word and help them to understand why it's important and it matters. And thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions now.
Thanks so much, Karen. That was fascinating. So much great information there. If people have questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat and I will read them out. Karen, I just had a question of my own to start with. How does sphagnum spread from one area to another?
It releases spores, and so those some of them are unisex and some aren't, but they can release spores into the environment, and then the wind catches them, and some of them just through the action of releasing can spread up to 20 centimeters. So that's pretty incredible for a tiny little plant.
Okay, thanks. We have a question from Janet. Have you identified any vulnerable areas on Georgian Bay, and what could be done to mitigate any deterioration there?
Specifically, I in the area that I'm in Puerto Barrow, I haven't seen peatlands that are being highly disturbed by anything that's going on in the area, but I do understand that there are some to the south area of where I'm working. And the best thing that we can do is to really prevent the environment from being changed, as I mentioned, to stop things that are going to change the flow of water or the flow of nutrients in them. So Things like roads will make those changes, or buildings, or any type of development. If you pull down a beaver dam, for example, that can cause a rush of water. Things like that can change. And also things like road salt, even inputs of road salt can be detrimental to peatlands and change the environment.
Okay, thanks. We've got another Janet asking a question. Is it bad to step on sphagnum moss?
It's not terribly bad. I mean, they are sensitive ecosystems, but you can walk across them, but they can be fragile in that they're not always the safest place to walk. I have kind of fallen through them before. It's sort of like quicksand when you get through, because it's if you think about it, it's a mass of roots holding it together, and underneath that is water. So you really need to test where you're walking and just to make sure that it's safe to step on. But as long as you're not constantly walking over it, it's like other plants that will bounce back.
Okay. Helen's wondering, what is the structure that forms the mounds? Is it an individual plant or a family group?
It's a group of them. What the sphagnum is doing is it doesn't want to be totally submerged in the water. It wants to be out of it. So it starts to, as it grows and develops, it kind of mounds up. And there's species that prefer to do that. And so those ones will kind of try to mound up and almost be out of the water. And then they use their wicking ability for the water. And so then also when there's a rush of water coming in, those ones are not completely drowned by that rush of water.
Okay. Catherine's asking, what is it about sphagnum and moss cells that makes it so resilient to freezing and drought, for instance?
Um, I'm not exactly sure what makes it resilient to freezing. I know they have fibrils in them which help with the supporting structure. I'm not. I have to honestly say I don't know that much about that component of the structure, but I would have to assume that those fibrils are strong enough and flexible enough that they can bounce back.
Okay. And then we've got several people asking questions. Catherine, Barb, and Ella all have similar questions, which is, has sphagnum moss ever been cultivated? Or can people facilitate growth of sphagnum? Would it survive in a backyard, etc.? So planting, cultivating sphagnum.
I mean, it's definitely been done. Growing it in your backyard is probably very difficult to do because you need the low acidic water with low nutrients. So it would be very hard to make a container, I think, that would be able to meet those requirements. But it certainly can be done. I just have not personally seen it done, but I imagine that it could be done. But you just have to have really strong controls over everything that's entering it.
Okay. Gail is asking which animals depend on sphagnum.
Like large mammals, is if that's the question. Large mammals use it for hunt grounds. Bears will come into it to hunt. Moose do as well. Moose will also sometimes peatlands have like an open pool area, like a water more aquatic area, and within that area there'll be plants growing that they'll want to come in and eat. Um, Pretty much all the types of different forest mammals will come either out or through it. They'll use it as a hunting ground if they're not using it as a bedding or breeding or hibernating area, then they usually will probably are passing through it and using it as some type of a hunting ground.
Okay, thanks. Suzanne is wondering if it's still used for fuel some places.
I actually don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if it's still being used for fuel in some places. I know it's still being removed for horticulture. Um, I believe that in the UK they've tried to almost put a complete stop to that though, but I'm really not so sure if they're still using it for fuel anymore.
Okay. Jonathan's wondering if it's normal to see fungi in moss and do they have any kind of partnership?
I don't know the answer to that question actually, Jonathan. I really don't know. I can't remember ever seeing any in sphagnum moss. So, but There might be instances of it in areas that are more towards the outside edges than there are in the interiors.
Okay. And Barb is wondering if it sinks more carbon than all of the forests in the world, why are we not looking into studying and promoting its growth?
Well, as I mentioned, it's really hard to promote the growth of it because it's a natural occurrence and there really isn't anything we can do to change that. It's more about protecting it. Um, I don't think that we can create areas of peat, and because it just takes so long to develop, our efforts are they're great efforts, but they go very, very slowly. As I said, it accumulates at 1 millimeter a year. So it just takes so long to develop it and to build it up that it just makes a lot more sense to protect it than it does to try to work at restoration.
Okay. Rose is asking, what are the role of beavers in creating peatlands in the Georgian Bay region, or where are
Oh,
they found around Georgian Bay?
oh, that's a good question. So the way the beavers help create peatlands is because they block off water sources. And so, as I mentioned, peatlands tend to have uh, not as much water source as a swamp or a marsh. And so, because they have water that's mostly rainwater, they only have small inputs into like fen type peatlands. They have only small inputs of water from other sources, so it's mostly rainwater. When beavers block off areas, they can start that development of a peatland because there's not the same input of water. And again, this is going to take thousands of years to change because not only does it need to develop peat, but it also needs to change that entire environment. So it takes a very, very long time, like I said, millions of years. But beavers would have, throughout history, probably had a good part in that.
Okay, thanks. Katie's wondering if there are maps showing existing protected areas around Georgian Bay. I'm not sure if that's
Of
for peatlands specifically or just any protected areas.
There are maps, and I know that Muskoka Watershed, they also have a map of peatlands in the area that go right across to Georgian Bay through their whole area. Their map has, um, it specifies whether there are fens or bogs or other types of wetlands, so you can look at that resource. I'm sure there's lots of it. I think Ducks Unlimited also has a similar map, so you can go on an ArcGIS program or to their website and you can go through their interactive map and you can click on the different sites that tell you what wetlands are there, and they include both the fens and the bog peatlands as well.
Okay, interesting. Thanks. Janet's wondering, can you remind us of the distinction between peat and sphagnum?
Yeah, peat is the accumulation of sphagnum. So sphagnum moss is what grows, and peat is what accumulates from the dead plant. So it's underneath the living portion. So the living portion is called the sphagnum moss, and the portion that's accumulating because it is dead, that is what peat is.
Awesome, thanks. Suzanne says, why is the use in gardens not discouraged? Um, yeah, just about discouraging use in gardening. Could there be more messaging on packages like cigarettes? And is the use in gardens decreasing?
The use in horticulture and gardens is decreasing, yes. The reason that people love it, though, is because, like I said, it absorbs lots of water and releases it really slowly. And so that's why it's been used so heavily in horticulture. There is a really big push to stop using it. And I think that a lot of companies are starting to find other ways to have their soils do a similar action with the moisture retention, but there definitely is a push to stop using it, although I don't believe it's strong enough. I think that push needs to be a lot stronger than what we currently have.
Okay. Unless any more questions come in here quickly, I think that's the end of our questions. Thank you so much, Karen. This has been amazing. So much to learn about sphagnum. And yeah, a couple other people saying thank you as well in the
Thank
comments.
you very much. Thank you very much. I
Um,
enjoyed presenting.
awesome. Okay, and I will just now hand it over to Janet for some final remarks.
Thank you. Karen, my goodness, I sure did learn a lot tonight. and I will have to reconnect with you on many things for further education. I found it fascinating. So the video that Karen's presentation will be posted on our website shortly for you to review or to share with your family and friends. So don't forget to do that, as well as for those of you who have been in our other presentations, don't forget to share that, because we've had 4 really fabulous presentations this spring, and it's all done by staff at the GBLT, so you can see how deep our content and our education and our experience really is. We've got an amazing team. So come out and see us this summer. So coming up this summer, if it ever gets warm out there, my goodness, we have Erin's Big Day. And you may ask, what the hell is that? Well, it is a birder's dream to go out and spot or listen to as many bird species as possible in a 24-hour period. The record that Erin and team has held was in 2024 with 133 species seen or heard. So we want to know, can they beat their own record? So we will see. If you want to get more involved in this, you can pledge your support now by visiting our website. So please don't let May 16th go by without checking into our social feeds. Sarah will be out letting us know, not quite hour by hour, but very regularly, where they are, what they've seen, how many they've accumulated. It's kind of a fun day to stay in tune with. Our summer events calendar is almost complete, so please keep checking the website for our postings for all of the great events we are hosting this summer. Our conservation team is loading into the Bay next week, ready to tackle 6 research projects. And the corridor project teams continue with boots on the ground, literally, walking and monitoring and inventorying all 3 areas of the corridor. So it's going to be a very busy and fun summer. And in closing, we're just so grateful for all your continued commitment to conservation and supporting our work on the Bay, and for your amazing support in making sure these pristine wilderness lands remain intact for generations to come. We hope that we can count on your support again this year. It's easy, as I say, you just have to visit gblt.org/donate and hit pledge, and we make it easy. So I hope you can help us. Thanks, everybody. Hope to see you in the Bay this summer. Good night.